Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Benjamin Wheeler, but by now you probably already knew that. And I'm here today with the first of what's hopefully going to be a long running series of deck techs and gameplays for the Canadian Highlander format. I'm going to be covering iconic decks of the format, staple archetypes, kind of giving an overview of them, and then have some accompanying gameplay so you can see that there's some walk to the talk. I'm going to be focusing primarily on well-known and competitive decks that have proven themselves, especially if it's recurring wins on Monday nights or Thursday nights, or decks that have won major events, Highlander vs. Staples events, or the year-end tournaments. And I'll be focusing in the beginning on lists that I am quite familiar with, as you can probably tell with the CradleHoof behemoth looking you dead in the eye. And then we'll slowly work our way into decks that are a little more fringe, but certainly have a lot of potential. Not quite in the brouhaha area, but not your grandma's Highlander deck. So to start off, as I already mentioned, and as you can see, we're going to be tackling CradleHoof. That's the esports Wizards of the Coast name I would give the deck. It's also been known as Big Green, Cradle to the Grave. It's been incorrectly labeled as elves because, frankly, we don't discriminate mana dorks here. We don't care if you're a bird, a human, an elemental. If you add mana on turn... If you get us to 3 mana on turn 2, you can join our team. So this deck is a hypermana deck, and for those that aren't familiar with that, don't worry, I'm going to blab about this for quite some time. So hypermana decks have been around for quite some time, but they only really started popping up, I guess, in around 2009, 2010, which... God, seems like it was just yesterday, but let's keep going. Basically, they were championed by a man I'm sure you all know, Zvi Moshowitz. Zvi Moshowitz loves his mana acceleration. Now, he started out early, casting Llanowar Elves into an early Plow Under, and we all wish we can do that, but we're taking a different approach with this, and as he did as the tides of Magic changed to a more board control, creature-based interaction game. So there are a couple of points that you need to take into consideration when constructing a hyper mana deck. There are 7 to be exact, but don't worry, we'll cover them pretty quickly. Number 1, you have to have a good mana base. So we're mono green. We have a light splash of red and access to black mana for Deathrite Shaman activations. But other than that, we have plenty of basics. We're running, I believe, 16 basic forests in here. Side note, the exact list for this will be featured in the comments below, or in the description rather, so you don't have to just look at the screen and pen it all out. But anyways, you have to have a great mana base, which we do. We have access to all these basics. Our splash is super easy to get to, and it's not a splash that we need to rush to. Having a Domri raid on turn 2 is great, but it's not the end of the world if you have to wait until turn 4 or turn 5. The same goes with Xenagos and, of course, Rurikthar. Kessig Wolfrun, you're not going to be doing that in the early turns anyways, so that doesn't even matter. So, mana base, we got that. Number 2, the mana dorks that we have to be capable of turning themselves into threats. Well, we have a variety of ways that we can do that. It can be through cards like Elvish Archdruid that actually make a swarm tactic quite reasonable. It can be through cards like CradleHoof Behemoth or Caller of the Claw, which it seems like a cop-out to mention CradleHoof because the guy wins the game by himself. But he does turn all these little cogs into things that can just end the game. And Caller of the Claw can turn all those little dorks that they're probably going to want to get rid of anyways into an army of 2/2 bears. And of course, one of the highlights of the deck, one of the reasons to splash red, is Kessig Wolfrun, being able to turn any of your dorks into 9/1 trampling monsters, which that's pretty terrifying. So we have a variety of ways to turn our little dudes into things that can actually win the game. That's great. Moving on. Number 3. The actual threats, so stuff beyond Llanowar Elf or Boreal Druid getting really frisky, the actual threats have to end the game. Now, if you ask your average Magic player what life total they start at, hopefully they're going to say 20, and if they say anything higher, they're probably some heathen that plays EDH. But that aside, they're at 20. Dark Depths token, Merit Lodge, bless his soul, deals 20 damage. Sounds pretty good, right? Sounds pretty game-ending. Cards like Primeval Titan can find that. And if the 20/20 doesn't get it done, well, the 6/6 Trampler that hopefully, if you've untapped with, you'll get to find a Kessig Wolfrun just in case you want some backup, will do the job itself as well. And then you look elsewhere. Rurik Thar, 6 mana 6/6 with Reach and some other ability. What was that one? Oh, right. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rurik Thar is going to deal 6 damage to that player. Does that end the game against a Storm deck? I think it does. Is that a pain in the ass for Control to deal with, or Tempo? Last time I checked, they like to cast their Ponders and Preordains. So, ends the game. Even something as simple as Regal Force, which we're not running because it's a 5/5, we're running it because it's going to draw us 5 cards. But it's still a 5/5. It's still an idiot that's big enough that can crash through a majority of threats in the format. So, what we're ramping into, they end the game. I guess this also segues into covering the Planeswalkers. While the Planeswalkers themselves, sure you can get lucky and end the game just with them, they're mostly for value, to ramp you up, to give you some card draw, to be a general nuisance, but they all have the capability of ending the game, similar to, say, Regal Force. Number 4. Your threats have to be better than their threats. Going back to Merit Lodge, going to CradleHoof Behemoth, going to Rurik Thar. Rurik Thar is going to beat out their Yogg-Will if it stays in play. CradleHoof is going to beat out whatever gigantic life total they may have tried to accumulate over the game. And by gigantic, I mean it better be more than about 50, because usually that's what he does. And Merit Lodge, well, we've covered this. 20/20 flying indestructible, not that bad, as long as they don't have Bitter Blossom. Then you have to do some shenanigans with getting a CradleHoof into a Merit Lodge, and, well, I mean, that's just plain old good-fashioned fun, am I right? So, I'd like to think that we have some of the best threats in the game. Number 5, you have to be able to survive the aggro matchup. A control matchup's not going to be killing you in turn 3, 4, 5 even, unless they have some kind of combo variant, and then they can go fuck themselves. But a control deck usually is going to look for the slow grind, and while they have all the Wrath of Gods for your dorks, waiting until they play a threat, well, your threat's probably better than theirs. So let's talk about aggro. What do we have for aggro? Well, we have a couple walls. We got an 0-4, we got an 0-5, we got a 2-5, that's pretty good. We have a 2-4. We basically have a bunch of cards with huge asses, and some cards that also just gain us life. It's one of the main reasons why Kitchen Finks, as much as it pains me to say, is great in this deck. Because it's a creature, comes down, impacts the board, gains us some life, aggro has a hard time dealing with it, and against the control deck, it ends up replacing itself. Courser of Crewfix, while it doesn't follow any of the other factors, which we'll touch on later, it does a great job of preventing old Curdape from cracking in. And even if it does end up dying, well, it's probably taken a Bolt and a Curdape, and hey, 2-for-1s ain't bad for this kind of deck. So the aggro matchup, in my opinion, is actually just a cakewalk. Number 6. Every card in your deck has to supply mana, or be a threat, or be able to replace itself. This is something that is super important. This is something that has caused my deck design to kind of take an approach where, in this kind of deck, you'd probably want Sylvan Library, or you might think that playing Xenagod is the right thing to do. The problem is, Sylvan Library comes down, if you're looking for just any card to survive off the top of your deck and you draw a Sylvan Library, you're fucked. Xenagod, while he's great and some people like to play him, when he comes down, if you don't have a threat, well, he doesn't do anything. He kind of just sits there. So every single card in this deck is either a mana source, finds a mana source, is a creature, or it finds creatures. So we have all that covered. That's super important. I cannot stress this enough. You can take risks in running Sylvan Library, and that's actually not that big of a risk, 1 card out of 100, but I like to stick to the rules. And finally, number 7, recovery. You have to be able to recover from a Wrath of God or a board wipe, whatever it may be. The control matchup isn't as bad as it's made out to be with this deck. You just have to know when and where it's fine to play your mana dorks. Maybe you only play 1, or maybe you only drop out 2. Kind of read the situation. Are they playing out a stone? Are they swordsing your mana dork? Gauge what's going on and act accordingly. That's kind of a blanket statement because that's really just how most Magic should be played. But in a matchup where if you overextend, it's game over, you gotta play carefully. And that's the big thing with the control matchup. But thankfully, we have the recovery. We have cards that when they die give us an effect. Or we have cards that by themselves will add multiple copies to the board. Or we have haymakers like Caller of the Claw, which, nice Wrath of God, how about taking 10 damage? And cards like Planeswalkers as well, if they tap out for a Wrath of God, tapping out for a Planeswalker, which itself is a threat, that ends up putting out a threat, well, that's 2 different things that they're going to have to deal with, and one of them being a little difficult once it's stuck on the table. So now that we've covered the basic rules of Hypermana, let's actually get into the deck itself. Let's start with the bread and butter. Let's start with the mana. Ideally, you have a mana producer on turn 1. In fact, I would mulligan pretty much every hand unless it's some degenerate draw involving Dark Depths that didn't have a mana producer on turn 1. It's just simply what you need in order to get the machine going. Thankfully, while most decks that run mana dorks tend to have 9, 8, maybe 10, we have 17 different cards on turn 1 that can produce mana to get us to a 3-drop on turn 2, or 3 mana on turn 2 to be more specific, but I'll touch on that later. So that's fantastic. Nothing else to really say there. We have a shitload of them. You need them. Good. But then we get to the mana producers that cost more than 1 mana. Well, then they have to do something else. It takes a very special kind of mana dork to get into this deck at 2 mana. It either has to add beyond 1 mana or have the capability to do so, such as Elvish Archdruid or Priest of Titania, which can regularly add 2 to 3 mana. They pair quite nicely with a turn 1 mana dork as well, so look out for that. They have to be able to advance your board positioning, something like Nest Invader, where while he's not really a mana dork himself, he creates a body that can add mana. And even though it's temporary, because you have to sacrifice the spawn token, the game might be temporary too if you're using that spawn token to cast a natural order. But it's 1 card that creates 2 bodies, which is great for Gaia's Cradle, and one of those bodies happens to add mana. Or cards like Wood Elves, where while Wood Elves itself doesn't have mana, it puts a body on the battlefield that's an elf, so that's also nice. And finds a forest, so it can help with your splashes, or it can find Dryad Arbor, which is an additional creature that produces mana. So a Wood Elves into a Dryad Arbor with a Gaia's Cradle in play, that's 3 extra mana. Not on that turn, it's only 2 if you have the Cradle, because the Dryad Arbor obviously can't tap itself, but for future turns, 3 extra mana. Cards like Scrib Ranger, which having Flash and Pro Blue is surprisingly relevant in a field with Vendilion clicks running around and Snapcaster Mages, and the untap ability, the Quirion Ranger ability, is one of the most underrated abilities for this kind of deck. And last to touch on this, because I don't want to stick too long here, we have cards like Rattleclaw Mystic, where it's only a mana dork as far as what this card does. Just ignore the morph text for starters. You just have a 2 mana 2/1 that can add rug mana. So the blue doesn't matter, we're not going to be using that unless you get into some shenanigans with Thespian Stage, but I digress. It just adds red and green, the 2 colors we need. Sometimes your bird is going to get bolted. In fact, there's a large collection of people that believe that you should always bolt the bird. And maybe I'm a little biased, but I wish that they wouldn't do that every fucking game. Anyways, so if they don't bolt the bird, great. You morph this guy face down, and then later you can unmorph it, adding 3 mana and tap it to add another mana, which accelerates you very, very quickly while also giving you access to your splash colors. If not, and you don't have other 1-drops, like you can't go 1-drop, they bolt it into 2 1-drops, then you just have this 2-power creature that can add mana, can kill off a Jace Bellerin if they decide to get a little frisky early on, thinking the coast is clear and whatnot. But no, it does work. I wasn't too sold on this card originally, but after kind of playing with it a bit more, I like where it's going. But that's the mana. The other cards that can be mentioned are Sad Robot, which technically ramps us from 4 to 6, which is great. Or Kozilek's Predator, which is Nest Invader on steroids, giving us 2 dudes instead of 1, and having a 3/3 body to boot. But that really just leads into a great segue for the next section. Value cards. The cards that replace themselves. So Kozilek's Predator, he's a body that puts out 2 more bodies. That's nice. If they deal with 1, well, you at least still have 2 more things. Sad Robot, sure you get the ramp, but if he dies, you draw a card. There are 13 different, air quotes, replace themselves cards. These are either cards like Wall of Blossoms, Carven Caryatid, or Elvish Visionary that when they ETB, they draw a card. We're playing every single, air quotes, playable ETB draws a card. We're not playing Wistful Selkie, just have had bad experiences with her, but I mean, if you're looking to really max out, do so. I mean, for Christ's sakes, we're playing Masted Myers and Multani's Acolyte, and cards like Masted Myers is one of the sleeper bombs in this deck because this guy just is so good for the control matchup, just grinding out card advantage, or the rock matchup. So 13 different cards. They either draw cards such as the Wall of Blossoms, Masted Myers, and whatnot. They have recursion abilities, Eternal Witness, and Den Protector, being able to return cards from your graveyard to your hand. We're not playing the regrowth effects because it's a little too reliant on having something, and it's not a body itself. Whereas, obviously, the powerful Witness and cards like Den Protector come into play and help bring something back. Or they replace themselves. So cards like Collar of the Claw is worth mentioning, even going up as big as Thragtusk or Kitchen Finks, where if the original body is dealt with, there's still going to be something there to give control decks or decks that have a lot of removal a little bit of a problem. And so cards like Thragtusk and Kitchen Finks help transition into the final category, which is just straight up threats. These cards are value cards, certainly, but they are also threats. 5 power is nothing to snuff at. Woodland Bellower is a 6 power card that ends up replacing itself. So that's kind of in that category as well, but it's more of a threat because, 6 is 1 more than 5, last time I checked. But we've already covered this. Our threats are huge. Primeval Titan's insane, one of the best creatures in the format. CradleHoof Behemoth ends the game not by himself, he needs stuff there. Deranged Hermit puts out a shitload of 2/2s that synergizes well with Cradle. Rurikthar can just end the game against a combo matchup. And we've already covered how strong having Planeswalkers are, and boy, do we have quite a few. So that's that. I guess as far as threats go, there's 3 different categories, but I think we covered them. The transitional threats of Thragtusk and Woodland Bellower. The GG well-played threats, as in CradleHoof Behemoth and Dark Depths, or Rurikthar, and where if you get them out, well, they probably lost. And the Planeswalkers, which help provide value, ramping, as well as a threat on top of a threat. Now into the cards that help smooth out the deck. We get to the tutors. So obviously this deck is very centered around 2 cards, Cradle and CradleHoof Behemoth. We have 9 different cards that tutor up creatures. Not all of them can find CradleHoof Behemoth, and you can certainly add other cards that help get CradleHoof into play or into your hand. But 9, I kind of like where it's at right now. I wouldn't go too deep. Past versions of this deck have played Summoner's Pact, but I feel at 2 points it's a bit too much to ask. I rather shave off another card, which I'll get in after we're done the segment, and add Soul Ring. Because, I mean, how many games have you lost where you've gone turn 1 Soul Ring? So 9 different cards that tutor up creatures, fantastic. And then cards that tutor up lands, we have 4. Sylvan Scrying, Expedition Map, Crop Rotation, and Primeval Titan. Primeval Titan's he's a little big to be considered a tutor, but hey, he does work. We're not including Nissa Vastwood Seer in this because, I mean, finding a basic forest into your hand, that's not exciting. And Wood Elves is also not going to be, it's not something you want to call home about. So that's pretty much everything in the deck except for the cards that don't exactly fit in specifically to these categories but have some kind of carryover. These are the misfits. Courser of Kruphix. It doesn't replace itself necessarily. I mean, it can because it provides you extra value, extra reach to take a simple game action. But itself, it's just a 2/4. It's great to have because off of a mana dork, it's always nice. Its ass is big enough and its ability is certainly convenient to have against the aggro matchup. Smooths out the draw, on curve, good versus aggro. I'm not going to say no to Courser. Reclamation Sage is another one, but you really just can't ignore it. I mean, it's 3 mana, destroy their moat, which is certainly a problem card for this deck. Cards like Ensnaring Bridge, also not fun to deal with. Just blowing up any artifact and enchantment, I mean, it's a great card. You're playing green, so you're probably playing Reclamation Sage. Bane of Progress can kind of get thrown in the same category, except, again, some decks, Bane is just GG well played. It fits this Rurkthar kind of role against Tolarian Academy decks or eggs, as long as they don't have Sunrise mana. Watch out for that. It does work. And then finally, we have good old Thrun. Thrun doesn't really replace itself. Thrun doesn't add any mana. Thrun doesn't help you get a 2020 Merit Lodge token. But it's a 4 mana 4/4 that can't be countered, that has hexproof that regenerates. It's such a pain in the ass for control decks to deal with, and it's so great post-Wrath. Because they do want to Wrath away your mana dorks. Your mana dorks can be just incredibly threatening. They can push you over the top. So having access to a card like Thrun, while he doesn't exactly fit the bill, he's just such a thorn in their side. He's kind of a GG well-played card, but he's a little lower on the curve. But, I mean, look at that face. We can make a quick little exception for this guy. To cover the points for this card, we are running a full 7-point spread. 3 points into Soul Ring, because, I mean, it's Soul Ring. 3 points into Natural Order, because, I mean, it's Natural Order. This deck is the reason why that card is where it's at right now. And 1 final point into Mana Crypt, because you're probably ending the game quite quickly. And if you're not, you better mize, because this deck needs a tiny bit of it. That's the one problem, that sometimes you'll get those draws where you just see a bunch of Hornet Queens and you don't see any Mana Dorks, or you see a bunch of Mana Dorks and you don't get any Hornet Queens. It's not going to happen very often because this deck is fine-tuned enough that you will avoid that. But you never know, you might die to your own Mana Crypt. But hey, it's a good story to tell. So the only other card really that I would consider for this list, or that have played in this list, I guess there are 2. Mox Emerald. It's not as good as I had thought it would be. I mean, sure, playing it out, it's a free mana dork, but 2 points for that card. I rather just use those points on Mana Crypt and Soul Ring, but then those are 4 points, while the other 2-point card is Summoner's Pact. I just think having quicker mana, because of the way that these creatures are coming out now, cards like Woodland Bellower and whatnot, that supply us with a big-ass body and a tutor stacked onto it, you just, having the quick mana is just so much better. So much better. So those are the points. The only other thing I can think of commenting on would be the lands, having Bayou for Deathrite Shaman activation. We covered that. Bloodstained Mire is kind of neat because it finds a mountain or a swamp, so you're rarely finding your Bayou unless you actually need it. Same with Taiga and Stomping Ground. But it's another fetch land, which helps out with Deathrite Shaman. Getting him bigger helps out for just another shuffle effect in case they have a JTMS or whatnot. And it can find green mana. So it's like your 5th green snapland. Dark Depths we've covered because it's broken. Nykthos is essentially Gaia's Cradle Jr. Horizon Canopy, it's just, I mean, you're a green deck. I'm kind of in the camp of if you're not a deck that's losing to aggro immediately, then play Horizon Canopy if you're in green or if you're in white. You don't necessarily have to be in both. It's just that good. And that's the deck. As far as matchups go, I'm inclined to say that the only matchups that are really bad are going to be the Rock, so black-green, that Alistair Howie, he's always on it, he's always going to Shriekmaw it, and then Necromancy the Shriekmaw, and then that matchup's just a nightmare. It's winnable. Every matchup is winnable with this deck because, hey, you have Natural Order combo, but it's a pain in the ass, I tell ya. The control matchup, it's not the worst. Blue-white is not that bad. I mean, they have more Wrath of Gods than Grixis would, but that's fine. You learn to play around it, or you learn to coax them into playing it so you can get some weird Call of the Claw shenanigans going on. And they don't have the best... I mean, they have the best spot removal, but they don't have a lot of it. Or they have spot removal that's disruptible. Esper is a bit of a different story if they're overloading on Wrath of Gods, which they can usually do because they have hand attack for the combo matchup. That's a little tough. Grixis is tough because they have a lot of cheap spot removal, and now they're getting more and more Pyroclasms and Wrath of Gods. The blue-white-red one, depending on their build, they like to play some burn, usually in the form of Electrolyze or Fire Ice, maybe a Lightning Helix. Some of them play Arc Trail, that's a little rough. Getting Arc Trailed out is also quite bad, very bad. God, it sucks to get Arc Trailed or Forked Bolt out of the game, so watch out for that. It will happen to you, and it will be one of the worst experiences of your life entirely, you know? That might be an assumption, but hey, I'm willing to take risks. Anyways, that has been the main deck. This has been the list that if I were to enter a tournament this day, I would be playing this exact 100 cards. And following this will be I guess the sideboard, your optional package, because you're not stuck into these 100 cards. You can make certain concessions to shifts in the metagame. And let's hop on over to cover that. So here we have 2 selections of cards out of a total of 4, where if you have a pretty good grasp on what the meta is going to be, and you want to switch up your deck to combat that, even though, again, the deck has a pretty good matchup overall, these are the cards that you want to be looking at. In the top column, we have cards that I would suggest bringing in if you predict a combo-heavy meta, mostly a Storm combo or a Doomsday combo, basically the slow, grindy one, Enchantress even, some Academy decks, more so the all-in ones as opposed to the controlling kind of variants. And you might notice a recurring theme. So we have Findhorn Elder, Greenweaver Druid, Nantuko Elder, Shaman of Forgotten Ways, and Summerwald Sage, all filling the exact same role. They are 3 mana dorks that generate 2 or more mana. And while they're incredibly frail, it doesn't really matter in the combo matchup, because it's essentially 2 ships passing in the night. It's all about racing. So you can have a turn 1 mana dork reliably into a turn 2 any of these folk. And that then leads you into a turn 3 Primeval Titan, which means turn 4 they're dead. Or a turn 3 setup for a turn 4 CradleHoof, they're dead. And that's essentially what you want. You want to race. The only cards that don't really fall into that category at top would be Summoner's Pact, which is there if you want to switch around your points, because, hey, it's find CradleHoof and kill them, and that's pretty good. Or find Rurikthar and make it so that you don't die. It's nice to have that as an option, and it's nice to, even though I don't want to, throw this card into every single build, it's nice that you can switch your points based on what you're expecting. And then Shizuko, Caller of Autumn. Well, I've only played with her once, and to varying levels of success, mostly on the downside. She is pretty good if you predict fighting a lot of, again, Doomsday or 5-color Storm, or even mono red, although she's not the best there. Basically, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they add 3 green mana to the mana pool. That mana, until end of turn, mana doesn't empty through phases, or rather that mana, so they can't float their own, but they get that 3 green. And for Doomsday or for 5-color Storm, really that only opens up playing a Signet, or possibly just making it a little easier for them to cast a Beseech the Queen or something like that. Which, if you get to untap with her, you're winning the game. Usually. Probably. Let's hope so. Again, she's quite suspect, a little risky, but in the right place at the right time, she might be exactly what you need. A recurring theme with all these creatures is that they're quite vulnerable, and they're expensive. You're paying 3 mana for creatures that you're just going to get fork bolted or arc trailed out of the game, and that's not where you want to be. So when gauging the meta, you want to throw these guys in when there's plenty of combo, you're looking to go as quickly as possible, and there aren't many arc trail decks running around. That said, if there are a lot of arc trail decks running around, you might want to consider the bottom half. We have Overgrown Battlement, Sylvan Caryatid, Vine Trellis, Scavenging Ooze, Wistful Selkie, and Palaka Worm. So this is really centered around the, air quotes, Defender Mana Dork package of Caryatid, Trellis, and Overgrown Battlement. Trellis is really hard for an aggro deck to get through. I mean, just look at that ass. Overgrown Battlement is Trellis, except it can also be a Priest of Titania occasionally. Caryatid can't get bolted out, does a great job of blocking, and helps with any splashes. So this is great because they can't reliably be arc trailed out of the game. So that helps against the aggro matchups. They pretty much block everything, and they're still explosive if you have the right combination of them. Wistful Selkie is just another dude that you can trade with one of their guys, chump block with one of their guys, and get a card off of it. Not too exciting, but time and place. Scavenging Ooze is a great card against pretty much everything. He's one of the, 102nd card where you can actually just flip him in and out in pretty much any meta. It depends on how you feel personally. Because he's good in the combo matchup, he's great in the aggro matchup, control, like he's just overall good. It's just he doesn't fit the theme. He's in that spot that Thrun currently occupies, or Courser of Crufix, and I feel like those two are just a little bit better at what they do than the Ooze is. That said, when the Ooze is good, the Ooze is great. Being able to muck around with their Snapcaster mages, preventing them from treasure cruising, being able to gain some life or deal with the fact that you may have lost a soldier or two along the way, but don't worry, you'll gain that life back, and here's a 4/4. Palaka Worm is a nice end game threat that you can have. Trample on such a big body is great, and gaining 7 life as it ETBs, that's a huge swing. If you resolve this guy against an aggro deck, I cannot fathom how you would lose that, unless of course there's a Sulfuric Vortex, and then you have my condolences. And if they somehow kill it, well, guess what? You draw a card, and that's some nice value. So if you're seeing a lot of arc trails, go with the bottom side. If you aren't seeing any arc trails, but you're seeing a lot of dark rituals, let's go with the top side. And now let's move on to the second half of our quadrants. We have the top half, where if you find a lot of Tolarian Academies running around, because if there's one, there's usually about 3 more. They might slowly creep in, but for whatever reason, when one person starts playing that deck, it becomes infectious. Or alternatively, workshop decks, BattleBots, Time Vault combo, that kind of jazz. Whereas the bottom half is our attempt at attacking the control matchup. But let's start with the top. As you may have noticed, we have a lot of Uktabi orangutans. We have the orangutan himself, Viridian Shaman, Vithian Renegades, and Acidic Slime, all filling the same kind of role. They come in, they blow up an artifact. Slime is kind of nice, he costs a bit more, but being able to blow up a moat by chance, or even just get rid of their academy, that's always something you're looking to do. Freyalise is a planeswalker that fills the same kind of naturalized role. I feel kind of bad saying naturalized because in my heart I know it's disenchant, but hey, we're mono green, let's stick to it. It's a naturalized effect, it also can pump out more creatures, and its alt is kind of relevant. I mean, it's pretty easy to get to, considering the Academy decks don't really put too much pressure on permanents or planeswalkers. It's not going to be a game ender. It's more nice to kind of build up your loyalty so you can reliably crack down on any kind of board they might try to build up. Dust Bowl is in a similar position where it's able to crack Academy, and you don't need a huge amount of lands against that deck. You just want to make sure that you're not dying to them. Not as good in the workshop aggro matches, but if you're in the slow grinding Academy, you know, just Dust Bowl them out of the game. Terastodon and Woodfall Primus, both gigantic creatures that come down, blow up a non-creature permanent, and end up being hard to deal with, or if they deal with it, well, they got more things to worry about. Terastodon can come down, blow up one of their things, two of their things, and give you an elephant, because hey, you know, who doesn't like elephants? And Woodfall Primus, if they somehow destroy in blue, I can't imagine that happening that often, but still, if they get rid of it, if it dies, he comes back, and has with a vengeance. Those guys are big threats that you can put in that still progress the plan of getting rid of the stuff that they're trying to plant on the board. And then finally, this is a kind of a cute little interaction. We have Kozilek. I don't really like playing the Eldrazi in these decks because sometimes you get, you know, you can have the hands or the board states where you can generate 20 mana or so. And then you might think, oh, it's great, well, I have Emrakul. But the times where you just have it in your hand, it's kind of an auto mulligan, really. You can tooth and nail it out, and that's kind of cute, but that's why this guy comes in. Kozilek is the easiest to cast of them. Drawing 4 cards is great. Annihilator is great. Being a 12/12, good job, man. But really, if you're against Academy or a lot of combo decks that have an artifact kind of theme to them, they might have a Painter's Servant. And when they go to Painter Servant you and oops, Kozilek trigger, well, that's just hunky-dory if you ask me. And those decks typically don't apply that much pressure from creatures. So having something like Xenagos in your deck isn't as much of a liability. Because there's the whole theme of every card has to be, you know, a creature or a mana source. And this guy, you can play him and he'll be neither. You need additional things to make him work. But in those kind of matchups, you don't have to worry about that as much. It's nice to plop him down. They can't deal with it. And then, like, slowly you can turn him into a dude. Or the best thing is that he combos quite well with Kozilek. Because if you tooth and nail, find Xenagos and Kozilek, you get Xenagos to make Kozilek a 24/24 and crack in with haste, annihilator, all that shit. And they're probably dead. So that's the Academy package. Your Academy matchup's already pretty alright because you have Bane of Progress, which is the bane of existence for those decks, and you have access to Reclamation Sage. So it's not the worst, but again, when they pop up, there are so many of them. So it's always nice to have options. And these cards aren't that bad. Like adding Viridian Shaman and Vithian Renegades, or Uktabi Orangutan, like you can just stop there and be fine. You don't have to go the extra mile. Shaman's a nice little addition out of those three because it is an elf, so it interacts well with Archdruid and Priest of Titania. But really, I mean, who doesn't want to have a Sex Monkey in their deck? On to what we're trying to call the anti-control package. You don't bring in all of these cards. This is different from the combo package or the aggro package. These are cards where you pick and choose which ones you want to bring them because they help your matchup. It's not necessarily bad. I mean, your matchup against control isn't the greatest, but it's winnable. But, I mean, you know, make a switch here and there where some cards aren't exactly what you're looking for. So for control, we have, let's start off with the big one. We have Garruk Apex Predator. You know, you want to go big. You want to make them have to counter every single thing you've got or waste all their mana on dealing with your dorks. And having something like a Deathrite Shaman in play, which can easily just drain them out of the game until they deal with it, that's great. Like, it's slow and steady, but sometimes that's what you need. Get them preoccupied with dealing with the threats that you have, and then drain them out that way. So adding an Overgrown Tomb is a nice little nod to that, but also helps us cast Garruk. So he's huge, he has a shitload of abilities, he kills off their planeswalkers, he destroys anything they put into play, he makes creatures that are bigger than Trinket Mage and Snapcaster that trade with Vendilion Click. trade with calcite snappers. Am I right, folks? And the emblem usually just means game. Unless they have a moat or a maze of it, and then we gotta work around that. Sylvan Library, again, control matchups aren't going to be applying the pressure, so the rule of it has to be either mana or a dude we're not as strict. And in this matchup, you can slap down a Sylvan Library and pay 8 life multiple times in the game, hopefully, and really just help smooth out your draws, and that's what you need in this matchup. Fierce Empath, it's an elf that you can cast on turn 2 that can find your Primeval Titan or one of the threats that'll be coming up soon. Nothing too exciting about him. Again, he's just an additional tutor and a body. Again, your game plan in the control matchup shifts dramatically based on what they are doing. Sometimes your wombo combo happy feet natural order them out of the game, and sometimes you kind of spread out a bit. Fierce Empath, knock them, attack with the Scrib Ranger, use some Deathrite Shaman, Quirion Ranger shenanigans. It's just nice to have that. Speaking of the threat, though, that we would probably be looking, Gaia's Revenge, and on a lesser note, Mistcutter Hydra. So both guys have haste, they have can't be countered. Gaia's Revenge can't be the target of non-green spells or abilities from non-green sources. Mistcutter Hydra has pro-blue, and they're both big, dumb, and silly. Basically, this card is a control or a tempo player's nightmare. It's huge, it's hard to deal with, they have to wrath it, and if you get to 7 mana, well, they hopefully used their wraths already. Not hopefully, but you know what I mean. And he just cracks down. It sucks that he gets chump blocked, both of them that get chump blocked by Elspeth tokens, or Bitter Blossom tokens, but, you can't win every battle. I like these guys a lot. Onto the category of kind of spreading out. These are more value cards that border value and threat, which is really what you're looking for. We have Precursor Golem, Titania, Protector of Argoth, Wolfbriar Elemental, and Ren's Run Packmaster. So Precursor Golem, 5 mana, 3/3, makes a bunch of 3/3s. If something would kill it, it kills them all. That kind of sucks because it's if they swords one, they swords them all. Or if they path one, they path them all. Which kind of defeats the whole purpose of spreading them out. But it's the fact that it's one card that applies so much pressure, which is great. And 5 is in this weird mana spot where if you have one dork, or if you play out your dorks, they kill your board, you play another dork, you're usually sitting at 5 and 6. It's again one of those things where you have to play to recognize it, but it's certainly a pattern that pops up. Titania is in the same kind of spot where she's at that 5 mana mark, she's big enough, she gets to return a land from your graveyard to play, so kind of ramps you if you have a fetch land. Or if they've made you discard a land or wastelanded, tech-edged your Gaia's Cradle or whatever, that's always nice. And when a land ET comes into play from your graveyard, you get a 5/3. Hopefully you play her, you get back Gaia's Cradle or whatever, or a snap land, and you would get another 5/3. And that's a lot of pressure for control to deal with. Really interesting card, and would like to play more with her. Ren's Run Packmaster, 4 mana. It champions an elf, so kind of gives you a bit of insurance against a Wrath of God if they have a follow-up after playing out the Packmaster. It's 5/5, so that's incredibly huge, and it has a mana sink. You can just start pumping out Wolf's EOT without actually having to cast spells, so they have to kind of decide what they're going to do. It lets you put out value without investing any more additional cards, and can possibly save something important like an Archdruid from a Wrath of God. And if they're on a red variant of control, there's no way they're killing this 5/5 aside from a Murderous Cut or something. And then finally, Wolfbriar Elemental. This is a guy that was in the main deck for so long because he's just so good. The one downside is that, like everything else, he gets countered. And it's kind of predictable when you're leading up to him. So usually you're just playing him post-Wrath for a 4/4 and a 2/2. Sometimes even just having a 4/4 is what you need. But you can go ham. He also has a nice synergy with a Gaia's Cradle effect, where kind of that Hornet Queen, you make a bunch of dudes, and so your Cradle taps for some other big spell. This guy is just great. He's another kind of scavenging ooze card where he fades in and out depending on how I feel. But I think he's better on the board waiting for the right situation. And those have been the sideboard cards, so let's go back to the main deck for some final thoughts. So in conclusion, I feel personally that CradleHoof is one of the most powerful decks, possibly one of the best decks in the format. It's surprisingly consistent for what it's looking to do. It's very reliable for recovery, even though that's not something you'd see in a mono green deck traditionally. And the fact that you can have a deck where turn 1 Llanowar Elf into turn 2 Arbor Elf Elvish Visionary is a perfectly acceptable play amongst Ancestral Recalls, Black Lotuses, Library of Alexandrias, Mishra's Workshops. It really touches my heart. Really makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside, thaws my icy cold core, because it's an eternal format, and I think it really speaks volumes to the flexibility of Canadian Highlander, that you can enter with a deck that looks like you got your 12-year-old, 10-year-old brother to build for you. No offense to 10-year-old and 12-year-old Timmies out there, but there's a stereotype. And I think that this deck can only get stronger as the course of Magic, the creatures are getting better, the planeswalkers are getting better, and the wraths are, thank God, they're getting more expensive. We are seeing more pyroclasms come out, which is, I'll take what I can get. But if they keep printing more cards that help progress our number one game plan, but also can help us shift gears, stuff like Woodland Bellower or Nissa, I think that this deck is in for the long run. It's worth noting that while the complete spoiler isn't out yet, the spoiler for Battle for Zendikar has revealed 2 cards that come to mind. One being Cinderglade, which is the new dual for red and green. We do play quite a lot of basics, so being able to have another red and green source that comes into play untapped, that you can find with Wood Elves, that you can find with a fetch land, I mean, that's fantastic. That's an auto-include in this deck. And the other one being I believe it's Green Warden or Game Warden, 6 mana, 5/4 or 6/4. When he ETBs, you Eternal Witness, and when he dies, you exile him an Eternal Witness. I think that guy might have a position. He's definitely one that I would want to play around with, because having more Eternal Witness effects is always quite nice. So anyways, thank you for watching the CradleHoof Decktech. Stay tuned, because we'll have accompanying gameplay footage where I will essentially throw this through a bit of a mini gauntlet, looking to play 3 matches a la an 8-4 on Magic Online, to give it a test. But anyways, look out for that. But if you don't want to, hey, well, enjoy the Decktech and have fun CradleHoofing people out of the game. Cheers. Thank you for watching, and if you like that, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more hidden gems, set reviews, deck techs, and much more. Also be sure to follow our Canadian Highlander Facebook page, and check out our newly updated website at canadianhighlander.wordpress.com. Links for our various podcasts will also be included in the description below. Thanks again, and feel free to leave any questions, comments, or concerns, and one of the council members will be sure to answer as best as they can. And remember, folks, there can be only one.